Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
You intentionally sabotaged me on this, for the record. All right, so we're talking about placing feed for animals, whether it be with the intention of supplemental feeding or baiting.
Mm-hmm.
And this conversation oftentimes revolves around aflatoxin and corn, right?
Yeah. In fact, you asked me before we started recording if we want to really focus on it, and I'm hesitant to do that because that always takes over the conversation like it's the only problem.
And the reality is that there are some other important issues that people need to be aware of. Although aflatoxin, I don't mean to downplay its significance either, and that's probably the reason it gets talked about so much, as we'll get to in just a second, because it does have potentially some very severe consequences.
Yeah, so I do want to take a moment to say, we presented it in the last episode, a lot of people are using feed for one reason or another.
Mm-hmm.
This is not to point fingers at people or any of that kind of thing, but we think that it is an issue that we need to cover in detail so that if you're one of those people trying to make that decision, you know what the implications are. And if you want to place feed for whatever reason and you're within your legal right to do it, be my guest. But we have been getting a lot of questions about this specific issue.
Right.
And I think it's widely relevant. I mean, in some of these previous studies, we're talking about 80 or 90% of landowners are engaged in some type of feeding.
I think that this discussion centering around the use of feed and bait for wildlife should be at the forefront of the turkey discussion right now, based on what I've read.
Especially after what I've read.
Yeah.
I don't want us to focus completely on aflatoxins right now. I would rather it be what do we know?
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about all the things that we have a fair amount of certainty from scientifically rigorous inquiry.
Yeah.
And we probably need to have an episode on just aflatoxins as well.
Right.
Not that we can't get into some of those details here, but it probably warrants its own episode. I don't know that any of the other ones do, just because there's not the scope of literature on the other areas.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can cover them adequately here.
Right. But I mean, to kind of further build on that, we're at a time of the year right now where, deer archery seasons have either opened or they're going to open soon.
Mm-hmm.
So undoubtedly, there's a lot more people that are placing bait right now to attract deer for photographic cameras or to attract them to their hunting locations. And so I think that this is probably a timely episode as well.
I agree.
But to kind of back what I said earlier about this topic being at the forefront of the turkey decline discussion, apparently I'm not the only person that has thought that it should be at least a part of that discussion, because while I was conducting my literature review, I actually realized that both the Strategic Turkey Management Plan for the state of Mississippi and for the state of Georgia talk about this issue.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the different ways that, placing especially corn feed or corn bait for wildlife could negatively impact turkey populations. And their biologists recognize that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that it's part of that. It may be part of more of them. I don't know. But it's certainly a widespread practice.
Mm-hmm.
So when we recorded our first hiccup and you wanted to go back and start over, I asked you the question, so I'm going to try to go through the same transition. I feel like we've got a lot of negatives here. I would like to start. Is there anything that you found positive?
So, yes, there actually was, despite how overwhelmingly negative the literature is when it comes to the effects on wildlife. I did find a paper by Murray et al. Where they did a synthesis on everything from the practice of using bird feeders to,
Mm-hmm.
intensive supplemental feed for quail, placed out over these feeding trails and everything in between.
Mm-hmm.
And they did find that there are certain instances where feeding was beneficial to populations. Are you familiar with that paper?
Yeah, I reviewed the same one.
Okay.
So that was the positive I found was what they dug up in their literature review. Really great. We'll provide the link in the show notes as always. That was Murray et al. 2016. If you're one of those that's clicking on these links, yeah, there were some caveats.
hmm And
So,
it sounds like you dug a little deeper into the paper than I did.
well, I don't know if that's true or not, but I
Well,
do
I wasn't sure of
remember.
the specifics on the circumstances under which it had a positive
Yeah.
effect.
Well, there's two circumstances in that I'm aware of where the feeding has had a positive effect, and none of them are with turkeys. So that said, I do feel like I dug up at some point, and I cannot find it again. A reference like from 1972 from South Texas, where they showed an effect that was positive, or at least not negative, on turkeys.
hmm
I can't find it again. So, with that being said, there may even be something specific to turkeys, and if somebody is aware of it, send it to us and we'll add it in. I can't find it again, which makes me think I'm misremembering.
Well,
But
maybe
in
our former guest Jason Harden's listening to this episode, and him being from Texas and
yeah,
their turkey coordinator, he may be familiar with that paper and shoot it our
yeah.
way.
Well, I'm not trying to sidestep it. I was going to cover it because I was trying to find positive stuff, to balance with the negative. But in the Murray et al. Paper, they basically were looking at supplemental feeding and baiting from a variety of contexts all over the world. They were focused a lot on nutrition and disease
hmm
and that kind of stuff. The positives that they found were specifically in the context of the species was of conservation concern, so it's not doing well for some reason,
hmm
and the feed was being introduced to rectify an issue with the species. And most importantly, they were matching the nutritional demands of the species during the time in which the feed was being provided.
hmm
And that's when it was positive. However, they also documented in that same review that a far higher percentage of the papers that studied the effect on nutrition actually showed that it was more commonly causing malnutrition than nutritional advantage.
Is that because the feed is distracting, if you will, the animal from a food source that would better meet its dietary requirements?
Yeah, I'd say so. It's like diversionary foraging.
Yeah, it's like the junk food
Yeah, they're
example.
eating the junk food instead of other things. The other context that I'm aware of is there has been some literature from northern bobwhite that when you are using feed trails, in other words, there's feed spread
hmm
out, it's not
Yeah.
all at one location like it is with a feeder. In that context, you can observe a bump in the reproductive
hmm
capacity. So you don't have, well, first of all, they're using a feed, usually Milo, that doesn't isn't as susceptible to the aflatoxin, and also,
Which, as I learned, is because it has a lower sugar content than corn.
yeah, the sugar structure doesn't support it. That's right. Um, the other, so it's not clumped. However, with bobwhites, when the feed is clumped, it causes an increase in predation. I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yeah, that'll probably be an episode unto itself.
Yeah. when it's spread out, you don't see those problems. And there's some work to suggest that it's subsidizing alternative prey, so it could actually help with
Mm-hmm.
predation if it's doing that. So those are the instances that I could find a potential positive.
Gotcha. The other thing that you brought to mind when we talked about Milo and why it's not as susceptible to aflatoxins.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One other thing that I dug up that I feel like is worth mentioning here, and I'm sure we'll bring it up again at some point, maybe when we discuss aflatoxin directly. But I didn't realize that cracked corn was worse as far as aflatoxin is concerned than whole kernel corn.
Yeah. Did you find a reference on that?
Yeah, that was something I randomly came across too.
Yeah.
Apparently, the process of cracking the kernel better establishes colonies of the fungus that produces the toxins.
Is it because the the surface area is altered, or is it
I don't
because it helps facilitate entry
I don't
to
know.
the
I'm not
salt?
exactly sure, but that stuck out to me because I know people who intentionally feed turkeys cracked corn.
Mm-hmm.
So that stood out as something that is a practice that should probably be avoided, especially if you're trying to intentionally feed or
Yeah.
attract turkeys with it.
Right. Okay. Well, I feel like we're nosing off to the negative. So,
So I've got a not so fun trivia question for you.
okay.
And I know this isn't an aflatoxin episode, but it is kind of
Well, we
our
can start with aflatoxin.
okay.
That's clearly an issue. People are aware of that, and you may not be aware of some of these other ones. So let's just start with the one you're aware of. These are things that we know to be true from investigation.
Right. Okay. So do you know how aflatoxin was discovered?
I'm gonna guess it was killing turkeys.
It was killing turkeys.
Uh, Lay it on me.
So this is from that paper that I mentioned to you before we
That's how
started
we
recording.
discovered it.
Yeah. So I found this out during my lit search, and that lit search kept referring back to a paper that was written by a guy named Blunt, Blount.
So, which
And
paper were you reading?
and so I wasn't able to find that original Blunt paper, but the
Okay,
Blunt paper was something. It was titled something about disease X, disease
disease
X,
X.
and I couldn't. As I searched and searched, I couldn't find an actual copy of that paper, but I found a paper by Pekova. That's the one I was telling you about earlier.
Yeah, that's what
Pekova
I was
et al.
thinking.
2021. And the title of the paper was Aflatoxins: History, Significant Milestones, Recent Data on Toxicity, and Ways to Mitigation. And it talked about the Blunt paper. And Blunt was actually this guy that he was some kind of like wildlife, or not wildlife, but like livestock nutritionist. And he was tasked with solving this problem where back in the early 1960s, there was a total of 100,000 turkeys, domestic turkeys, that died of what they at the time called X disease because they didn't have a
A
name for it.
hundred. How many thousand? 160.
100,000 domestic turkeys. They died of this disease that they called disease X because they couldn't figure out what had happened.
So there's feed contamination.
And so Blunt was the scientist that was tasked with figuring this out. And it turns out that all of these turkeys had been fed with contaminated Brazilian ground nut meal. Brazilian ground nut meal on a poultry farm in London. So this was in England. And most of the deaths were in 4 to 6 week old turkeys. Some of them were 10 to 16 weeks old. So there were a few of them were even older than that, but most 4 to 6 weeks old. And at the same time, they noted that there were liver lesions in ducklings, chicken, pheasants, cattle, rats, and pigs that were fed the same feed. And so they started
Mm-hmm.
forming this link back to that feed. And essentially, through Blunt's work, he discovered aflatoxins as a result of this in the early 1960s. And to add to that, throughout the literature, you will find that it says repeatedly that because of the physiology of turkeys, that they are
Mm-hmm.
particularly susceptible to it, and as far as I know, more so than any other species.
Yeah. Well, that is based on my inquiry. That is true. According to a book written on this subject, it was specific to birds. Birds are the most at risk, just in general, and that's in wild species, especially small birds, and you guessed it, turkeys, particularly sensitive. In the literature on domesticated species, turkeys are the most susceptible, according to multiple lines. So that's in that Moore et al.
Hmm.
2019 book chapter on this.
But I was absolutely floored to learn that it was a major turkey die-off that led to the discovery of aflatoxin.
Yeah, it honestly doesn't surprise me at this point, but that is striking. I mean, ugh. And it's not like it was yesterday either. This was like decades ago. So we have so much literature on aflatoxins because we've known for a while, I guess for decades now, that it's particularly problematic even in our own food supply.
Oh, absolutely. I
So we
actually
just have
came.
this massive amount of literature on that topic because of it.
Well, I learned through this literature review so many things that were really damning about aflatoxin that I didn't even realize or appreciate before. And one of those is that, especially in developing countries, that it's a major human health risk too,
Yeah.
and that it causes cancer. I didn't know that aflatoxins could be carcinogenic.
Well, it makes sense. It's definitely immunosuppressive.
Right.
In fact, in the Murray review, I don't know if you called it, but in 80% of the studies that evaluated supplemental feeding or baiting that were looking for immunosuppressive contaminants like aflatoxins at
Hmm.
feed sites, 80% of them found that it was uh, causing more prevalent immunosuppressive contaminants like aflatoxin.
You didn't happen across, because this is related to that. When you said immunosuppressive, it reminded me of this paper. It's one by Monson et al. 2015. So I got way off into the domestic poultry literature because of
Yeah,
the.
I've been digging around in it some too.
Yeah, well, because
I
they've
kind
learned.
of left it off my list here,
Well, it's
but go
very
ahead.
important. It's very important to that
Yeah.
industry, and this paper was called Aflatoxicosis: Lessons from Toxicity and Responses to Aflatoxin B1 in Poultry. And they reported that even low levels of aflatoxin in poultry feeds can cause reduction in growth, reduction in weight gain, reduction in egg production, and, as you mentioned, compromised immune functions.
Yep.
And that led them to say that aflatoxin essentially acts as a force multiplier that synergizes the adverse effects of microbial pathogens and other agents and factors detrimental to poultry health.
Hmm. I don't know if you remember, but I sent you a screenshot of that clip of text. Do you remember that?
I
You probably
don't.
don't because it was several
We
weeks ago.
Well, we trade so many of those screenshots too. Like every
Yeah.
time one of us reads something like that, it's.
Well, like I just got chills again from it. It's like that's definitely scary. So let's make it more relevant to turkeys for just a second. In Quist et al. 2000, and in I guess it's Ruber et al. 2007,
Okay, I didn't see those.
they were looking at turkeys specifically, and one of them, or both of them, wild turkey poults. I'm pretty sure. I know one of them was wild turkey poults. I'd have to look at the
Was this
other one again.
the challenge feed
Yeah,
study? Okay.
yeah. So they were challenging them with different levels of aflatoxin contamination, and they generally measure that in parts per billion.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so at 200 parts per billion, just
Can I
like you just said.
can
Yeah.
I stop you for just a second?
Yeah.
So for relevant background, the FDA recommends only feeding corn to wildlife that has aflatoxin under 20 parts per billion.
Right.
That's the threshold that they've established as safe. And that's out of the bag.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that it can't grow it once it's out in the environment.
Right.
It can.
Well, no,
But
we
just
have
for
a
context, before you go in
yeah.
these numbers, like 20
Well, we're
is
about. I was going to circle back around to context.
okay. Sorry, my bad.
No, I wasn't going to say it the way you just did, so that'll add to it. And there's good reason why it's at 20. But in this study, they showed at 200 parts per billion, there was decreased weight gained, damaged liver, and compromised liver function, presumably, and increased mortality of poults that were fed diets
Mm-hmm.
with
At
200 parts per billion.
only 200.
Yes.
So
Now
go-
we
I'm about
we
to interrupt you
regulate
again.
we regulate it down lower than that, and that's
Right.
important. However, there have been a couple of studies that show right out of the bag, in a couple of cases, that it was higher than that for wildlife corn
Mm-hmm.
or deer corn or whatever.
Yeah, straight out the bag.
Yeah, and in Huang et al. 2022, this is that Mississippi study, when they looked at aflatoxins of corn that you put out that didn't have any detectable amount to start with.
Mm-hmm.
When they had it corn in piles, everybody always wants to like counter this argument with it being piled corn. Well, at day 8, when they put them out during the summer, at day 8, all of them were exceeding 1,800 parts per billion.
Mm-hmm.
So we got 200 causes problem for poults, and if you put corn out during the time that poults are on the ground, all of the piles after 8 days exceed 1,800. So we're not even close to the toxicity threshold. We have exceeded it in leaps and bounds, and we'll put up a figure of this if you're watching. We'll put this figure in here that basically you can start from zero with corn, but if it's exposed to moist, hot conditions, it grows uh, aflatoxin over time. And it
Mm-hmm.
only takes a few days before a large portion of it has higher than that threshold.
Yeah. I mean, once it gets to the levels that you're talking about, it's even toxic to mammals.
Right. In fact, I have a number on that. I was trying to find, well, what about deer? And one, now didn't make a note on who wrote it. I did find a reference for deer. Deer have liver damage apparent after being fed 800 parts per billion.
And
So we're
and it was at
double or
1800
triple, yeah,
after 8
after 8 days.
days. And
100%
I also
of
found a number in one of Dwayne Elmore, previous podcast guest.
yeah,
One of his graduate students' theses said that they documented a concentration in one pile of over 3,000 parts per billion
yeah,
in warm, wet conditions.
yeah. I think it was 2,000 and something was what Huang's top end
Mm-hmm.
was,
Yeah.
but alarmingly high levels. And that's when we're talking about at 8 days, 100%. Okay. That doesn't mean that you don't have any risk until that day. That grows over the preceding days, and it reaches unsafe levels on average much quicker for turkeys.
Right. And I think, one of the things that you hear talked about a lot in the corn risk mitigation conversation is I think it's not something that used to be talked about, but now we're increasingly talking about, and this is encouraging because it's a step in the right direction, mitigating that risk by not putting corn out during the
Mhm.
summertime. But I just talked about Dwayne Elmore's student. The student's last name was Dale, and they reported that aflatoxin concentrations exceeded safe levels, not just in August as you would expect, but also in September and December. So
Mhm.
even in December. Now, keep in mind that this is in Oklahoma, but places further north may not are probably going to be cool enough in December. But we have a lot of listeners from the deep south where it can get pretty
Yeah.
warm in December.
That
That
that's
time of year.
where that's where I'm most worried about it for sure. It's deep south because it's staying above that threshold. Now, I have some other notes on what the thresholds actually are. I was
Hmm.
not planning on getting into today, but think mid 70s and humid,
Yeah.
and we're growing, and there's not apparently a top end on it.
Hmm.
Like you're not going to get too hot.
Yeah.
So uh, I'm
I mean,
sure
we
that
hit.
there's a threshold, but
I mean, even in Alabama, we hit mid 70s throughout the wintertime on a
yeah,
somewhat regular basis.
but it's never wet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, not to belittle it, but
Whoever talks about Alabama and says it's a dry heat.
this is yeah, I think it's definitely worth us bringing up and making people aware of. In the Huang study, they had 16 mammal species and 18 bird species that they uh, documented using these feed sites.
Hmm.
So a lot of species, not just deer, coming to them. So there have been a couple of studies on this, including one that Huang was a part of, and one of my students also worked on in Mississippi.
Hmm.
About 75% of the use of feeders is non-target. So in other
Yeah.
words, it's not deer, because
Right.
most of the time people were putting feed out for deer.
Now, deer probably consume more of the corn than any other species, but as far as just the number of visits,
Yeah, or
you get
time
way
spent at
more.
feeder.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if they are eating most of it with the raccoon use, man. It's raccoons are usually leading the.
Yes.
That's not unique to the United States. So there was a European study that said 80% of the feeder visits were from nest predators.
Yeah.
So we're not even just talking about all the other species. We're talking about 80% of the visits were actually predators of their game birds.
Make that make sense for me, Marcus.
What do you mean? That you want to subsidize the
I,
predators or
make
what?
it make the trade offs make sense for me there. Like if you know, and that's one thing that I think we should back up and reflect on is that most of the people that are putting any kind of feed out there, they're trying to benefit wildlife. They're trying to benefit
Yeah.
turkeys.
Well, sure.
Um,
They're not doing. I mean, they're not
or at a
trying to.
minimum, just photograph them and do no harm, right?
Yeah.
But
Well, and I've interacted with a number of people on this, including some of my own family and friends, and I think everybody is in that boat. They're not trying to hurt anything,
hmm
and then because of that, and maybe some other human dimensions that I don't understand, uh, people get really defensive about this subject.
hmm
It's one of those few topics where I consistently I feel like if I say anything related to it, people automatically take a defensive posture.
hmm
Not necessarily to defend the practice, but I guess to defend their actions. Or I'm not sure why it invokes that, but it is one of those issues that people just get upset about it.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why. This is maybe something that we should have Kelly back on to discuss. Is
Yeah.
why?
Well, I kind of tried to get her to talk about this and predator trapping at the same time. But,
Yeah.
another thing that, since I brought that up, when you tell people about the predation issue, which I think we should go into some details about what we know here in just a second, but you bring up this potential issue with feeders, and people's response isn't to stop feeding, it's to start trapping.
Right.
So, anyway, I digress.
Yeah, I mean, but trapping doesn't erase the whole host of other issues that are there. And I I mean, I'm all for having discussion about best practices to mitigate the risk of feeding, because
Yeah,
there's going to be some people out there where it's legal that are still going to do it.
yeah.
But oftentimes the steps that we take to mitigate one potential negative effect does not diminish the negative effects of other factors. And I
Yeah.
guess that's kind of where I landed after going through a lot of this literature, is that it's impossible to mitigate every potential risk factor that placing particularly corn bait on the ground during warm times of the year poses.
Well, let's go through that hypothetically for a minute.
Hmm.
Okay, we're going to mitigate the aflatoxin risk. Well, we could go to a feed alternative, right, to corn.
Yeah, we could
So
go to Milo.
Milo's better. I hear people and they ask about supplemental feed, like pellets or whatever. Well, if that's grain based, it may not be helping.
And especially because it's been processed, I wonder if that
Yeah,
makes it like the
we need
cracked corn thing.
we need to look at it.
Yeah,
But let's just say that all around is more nutritious and doesn't have the aflatoxin problem.
right.
That actually might just make another problem more problematic. Well,
Mhm.
now is it a better supplementation to nest predators, for
Right.
example?
Yeah.
So,
And there's
now the
multiple
feed is
ways.
better for those other species. We need that data.
Right.
We need to understand how it's affecting predator population dynamics by
Mhm.
subsidizing them.
Yeah, we need to know that, and we also need to know how it concentrates their movements
Yeah,
and create areas of greater risk across the landscape. So there's two ways it could affect predation rates on turkeys:
right.
increasing numbers through increasing reproduction and survival, or just concentrating movements, especially if that's
Yeah.
in areas where
Well, and
hens
that
tend to nest and brood.
that coin has two sides because you could also concentrate turkey activity and nesting near feeders that are concentrating predator. Uh, anyway,
Yeah, and
let's
making the bird more reliable.
yeah,
I mean, that's why people hunt over bait, right?
right,
Increase their odds of encountering.
yep. So uh, let's get into some predation stuff. Did you find anything on adult predation?
No.
I didn't either. That data needs to be collected. I have some anecdotes. I've had it. I don't know how many, but several now. It's been more than three, so I'll count that as several. People sending me a clip, whether it's a video or images or whatever, of a predator catching a turkey or something at a feeder site.
Mm.
So
Which doesn't
that's
mean that
anecdotes.
to play devil's advocate, I mean, it doesn't mean that that bird wouldn't have gotten caught somewhere else
Yeah, that's right.
or in the
But
same
yeah,
spot
I
if the
don't
feeder wasn't
know.
there.
I don't know if the predation risk is probably higher if it's concentrating the prey and the predator's activity there.
Right.
But I can't point to any data to show that feeding is eliciting that. However, there have been a couple of studies. There was one that was Cooper and Ginnett, 2000, I believe, that was from Texas,
Hmm.
where they set out to look at how feeding might affect nest predation.
Yeah.
And they did show that there was elevated nest predation near feeders.
Okay.
100% of the nest were lost in the simulation near feeders. Or wait, I think it was 100% of nests were lost when there was drought.
Now, are these real nests or artificial
No,
nests?
they simulated nests. We
Okay,
don't have one on turkeys
right.
or any other species that I'm aware of. Maybe there is on some other bird species, but we have simulated nest studies, is what I'm about to cover.
Okay,
I'm not aware of real turkey nests, which is a problem, right? Especially, just because there's raccoons around more doesn't mean that the hen isn't going to defend her nest,
right.
which is not being captured in the simulated. But it does give me pause when I see metrics like these. When they had rain, and we're talking about 4 or 5 inches of rain, when they
Right.
got some rain over there in Texas, the fed sites had 100% loss still of the nest to predation, and the simulated nest in the non-fed was only 75% then.
Okay.
So still high predation risk of that nest, but it was quite a bit
Yeah, but
less.
I mean, 75% is what we typically see across the Southeast with real turkey nests. You lose
Yeah,
about 75% of them.
yeah, that's right. So that was 100 millimeters of rain. If you increase that to 120 millimeters of rain, you have 80% of the simulated nests near the feeder uh, are lost. 80% are lost. 40% of the nests are lost in the unfed.
Wow.
So now,
So it's still
that, yeah,
twice the
twice.
nest success on an unfed site
That's
if you
right.
get some decent rain.
Yeah, you have twice as high predation on nests when they're near the feeder when you have a lot of rain. Now let's talk about what that rain means real quick. So we went from all the nests are lost when there's drought to we get a little bit of rain, we get a little bit of success, and we get a little bit more rain, which for there I think is actually a banner year. I guess 120 millimeters was that 6 inches. Uh, so we've got this banner year. Well, that means you've got a flush of vegetation responding to that rain, i.e., better nesting cover, and now 40% predation on the unfed nest. This basically demonstrating what we've talked about several times, that habitat quality is affecting nesting success in these simulated nests, and it's buffering some of the impacts of the feeding, concentrating nest
Mm-hmm.
predator use. So, whether or not that transitions to real turkey nests, I don't know, but it definitely suggests the risk of loss to predation is higher there.
Yeah. Well, what stood out to me about what you just shared is that one of the most common situations you run into in the areas that I frequent is feed being provided on poor turkey habitat. And that is the example of no rainfall with feed.
Yep, everybody gone. But
And
it
I'm not
actually doesn't
saying,
matter that much because the nests are going to be lost anyway. But so where it really could be impactful is when you have moderate,
yeah,
when you have decent nesting cover around, the feeding can be pretty impactful from not feeding. I was about to say unfeeding. uh, the other thing, I made a note of this because I just want to make it clear. The effect size of habitat in that study, i.e., the rainfall, is
this is a corn
way
episode, and we're still going to find a way to talk habitat.
well, it's still way greater than predator removal studies. Even the ones
Yeah,
that show the benefit from a couple of study systems like quail,
yeah.
the effect size from that water in this case was
Water makes
far
plants grow.
greater. Yes, so that's a proxy for habitat quality. Um, yeah, so that's not the only study. There's also a study from the Jones Center. We'll put this link in there as well. They did the Texas study. They were placing feeders, nests, simulated nests at uh, a given distance from feeders,
Hmm.
whereas the Jones Center was kind of radiating out, if you will, from feeders. So they had
Hmm.
nests at different distances from feeders. They went
Hmm.
out to about 300 meters 255 meters, actually, 300 yards. Uh, they
And
went
I
out
assume
that
these are
far.
simulated quail nest, right? So small eggs.
Um, I think it was just chicken eggs in it, but I
Okay.
don't know. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. They were not intending to look at turkey nests, but
Right.
it is a simulated nest on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, that'd be interesting to see what kind of eggs they used. But in that case, they showed in the non-fed areas there was 30 to 50% success. So, in other words, 30 to 50% across the gradient out to 255 meters. 30 to 50% of them were not predated. In the fed area, or in other words, when they were gradient in distance from feeding, along the gradient, uh, successful nests were below 20% all the way out to 255 meters.
Wow.
So we're talking about maintaining like double the predation risk out to 255 meters. If you work out the math on that and how much area that is, that's about 50 acres
Mm-hmm.
associated with that feeder that has elevated risk for that simulated nest. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily translate to what a turkey would actually experience in the wild, but it definitely gives me pause. Even if she can whip on that raccoon, you know, if there's she has to leave the nest at some point, right?
Yeah.
She
Well, and I
can't
think it.
stay on the nest. She goes on excursions to forage and things during the day. So the increased frequency of interaction, I would guess probably even in the event she can defend it, it
Yeah.
probably still increases risks.
Yeah. Well, I think it doesn't necessarily give us an effect size, an actual number on how this practice is actually influencing turkey nest success, and it shouldn't be treated that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is sufficient data to suggest that it is having a negative effect.
Right. It has strong potential for that for sure. It definitely is something that makes me think we probably ought to look into this with real turkeys.
Hmm.
But that's a hard nugget right there.
And I was able to pull up the study, and they used Japanese quail eggs.
Okay. So it was small legs.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good. So I think a raccoon would probably eat a bigger egg too.
But what do
Just
you
my
know?
guess. I'm gonna go out on a limb. Okay. Well, do you have anything else on predation?
I didn't. I didn't even realize we were getting into it today, but let's cover it all, man.
Well,
Might as well.
that's what I have noted right here to cover the nest predation, and
Okay.
I'm going to dig around some more and try to find uh, adult risk. I'm pretty sure there's some from bird feeders, but I'm not aware of anything in wildlife feeders out, like
Yeah.
deer feeders or whatever.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just didn't find it.
Yeah, I mean, people capture these predation events on cameras over feeders all the time, but that's because that's where their cameras are, right?
Right.
So
Well, and
it's hard to.
you're concentrating the detection of wildlife at the feeder,
Hmm.
so you should just by chance be more likely to capture it there. So, uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I can't speak to that. However, it is concentrating the use of predators, so I don't think it'd be that far fetched
Right.
that that could happen.
Well, so you're concentrating a variety of species of wildlife and increasing their encounter rate with each other, which,
Mm-hmm.
as of course we just talked about, could increase the chances of predation, but it also can increase the probability of disease and
Right.
parasite transmission as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something else that I did a little bit of digging on. I mostly was focused on aflatoxin, but there's
Yeah.
quite a bit of stuff out there too about risk of disease transmission around feeders.
Well, I will note. Remember, 80% of the in that Murray uh, review, 80% of the studies that looked for it around feeders found immunosuppressive contaminants.
Right.
So they're all, the wildlife are being exposed to things that suppress their immune system. And now it's your turn. Go ahead.
Yeah. Did you get into Wang's 2022 paper on parasites?
Indeed,
You
I did, but I'll
you were
let you lay it
involved
out there.
you were involved in that one, weren't you? To some
Yeah,
extent?
I had a student in the
Okay.
same study. Yep.
Right. So in this study, they looked at sites with and without year-round supplemental feeding, and they collected feces from deer and raccoons around those feed sites.
And
So
yeah, and compared it to just a random site.
right, right.
Yep.
So they found that, well, what was really striking to me, they found a lot of things about what they refer to as the environmental load
hmm
of parasites, and
Yep. So just
that's what
think
they
of it
were
as pathogen loading. I say
exactly.
that term a lot. I see it in the literature a lot.
Right. Yeah. So basically, how icky
Yeah.
as I would.
How much bad stuff is there?
Yeah. I mean, it's like, how careful you are with your kids when you take them. That when they're using their own bathroom versus at a truck stop, because kids always just go up and touch the toilet.
Don't touch the toilet seat. Oh,
So
gross.
anyway, that painted a really clear picture, probably a vivid picture for people that they didn't really want to have. But
hmm
um, around spin feeders, they found that there was 326% more coccidia in feces on average compared to feeder types that did not dispense feed on the ground. I mean that blew me away. 326% more coccidia.
Ugh. Well, I think we should take a sidebar for a moment and talk about coccidia.
Hmm.
That is the pathogen that's been linked to game bird population fluctuations in Europe.
I did not know that.
There's also some human health consideration with coccidia.
Oh yeah, it'll make you sick.
hmm
I mean, that just blew me away. Around spin feeders, there was 326% more coccidia in feces compared to feeder types that did not dispense feed on the ground.
Yeah. So I wrote down a different number, and maybe I wrote it down wrong. I wrote down 308% increase in coccidia on feeders compared to not feeders.
That's right. They
That's
presented that. I
okay.
have that statistic down as well. The one that I mentioned was the one that kind of blew me away, but that one, I mean, is
Yeah,
equally as
like
remarkable.
even so, one of them, like the choice of feeder type is affecting the
Hmm.
relative proportion, and then if you just say on average across all feeder types, that's 300. So three times as much
Yeah,
when you have a feeder than when you don't, and then another 3.5 times as much in some types of feeders than others.
if it
Is
puts
that what
feed
you're
on the
saying?
ground. Yeah, that's
If
right.
it puts feed on the ground.
Yeah, with my
See,
statistics, somebody
that's the one that you would think that would benefit uh, aflatoxin
yeah.
because the feed isn't clumped.
Hmm. But if it's on the ground, and that's what I mean, that's what I'm talking about when I mentioned that earlier about there are ways that we can mitigate the risk of feeding, but it seems like almost every time you solve one problem, there's still another one there because
Yeah.
this is just a cascade, like a Jenga tower, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
of problems that you really feed is at the base of. And so you pull out any of those blocks and the thing still falls over because you've got disease, parasites, increased predation,
Mm-hmm.
toxins.
Well, and on top of it, man, that's a lot of money going into that feeder. I mean,
Golly.
not. I mean, the feeder itself and the feed that's going in it. I mean,
Yeah. And I mean, it's because people are, generally doing it to they think it's beneficial.
mm-hmm. Or to compete with their neighbors. I hear that all the time. Well, if I
Yeah.
don't do it, my neighbors are going to have all my turkeys or all my deer.
Well, maybe if both of you do it, you won't have any more of them.
I
Turkeys, anyway.
I definitely think this is at the forefront of what our conversation about the turkey decline needs to be. Like to not even have gone after this question to find data and see.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
it happens to coincide with the declines, the
There's a lot of
explosion of
smoke
feeding.
around it. It coincides with the declines, the timing of legalization of it or increased practice of it
Yeah.
tracks pretty closely.
On the scale of it in multiple places, I mean, where neither of us go on many properties that don't have a lot of feeders.
Yeah.
It's just, it's definitely something that I think we ought to be looking at more than we have.
But to to that point, there are states that ban feeding or hunting over bait that are experiencing declines.
That's
So
correct.
this is not a panacea. Banning
That
feeding or baiting is not
that's
a
right.
panacea solution to
Well,
turkey
I'm
declines.
glad that you brought
And
that up.
we never want to come across as being a single issue, but this should
Yeah,
be bumped up to higher priority in
yeah.
the discussion.
To not to ignore it completely, I think is unwise.
Right,
But you're making an excellent point. There are states experiencing declines where it is not legal to bait.
right,
So, that being said, that doesn't mean there isn't any out there.
right. That's right. One thing that I just remembered that we haven't even talked about so far, but is particularly true here in the Southeast is, we really have no idea about the dynamic because it's a complex one if it exists between bait or feed, feral pigs, and turkeys. I mean, even if it is as simple as that. What was the statistic that we talked about in that last episode? How many bushels per square mile? Can you remember that?
No, it was
I mean, it was
a
like a
lot
bushel per square mile
per day.
per. I don't think it was. Was it per day?
Yes, it was.
Oh my god!
I'm almost certain.
You know,
You can rewind to the last episode and
and you
see
just
what it was. It was definitely a lot.
it was a lot. And I mean, we haven't even talked about
Yeah.
how that concentrates feral pigs, and we're not necessarily saying that feral pigs are predating turkeys or their nest, but certainly they're a food resource competitor.
Would you like me to give you a couple of fun facts?
Yes, I would.
One, the Huang study, most of those sites didn't have pigs on them. Some
Hmm.
of them did. Two, pigs carry a ridiculous amount of pathogens. Like they're just they are pathogen loading themselves. Like it's
They're
uh
just a disease vector.
yeah. Three, there was a study from Georgia from Beasley's lab,
Hmm.
Jim Beasley's lab. I can't recall who the lead author was. We'll put it in here if we can find it. They were looking at uh, pathogens associated, or no. I'm getting this mixed up. They were looking at wildlife use of wallows,
Yeah.
and they detected a whole bunch of species, including turkeys. And the most common reason that wildlife were there were to drink out of it.
Mm,
Can
that's
you
nasty.
imagine drinking out of a pig wallow?
It's
That
like
being
drinking.
said,
It's like
every
drinking out of a truck stop toilet.
oh my god, pour me another one. Oh gosh. Now that being said, out there if you've fed wildlife in a place that has pigs that they're on top of it and
Hmm.
it becomes a big wallow.
Yep.
That's what the feeder looks like, is a
Yeah.
wallow.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's also work showing that there's tons of pathogens associated with the wallows. So I'm assuming there's probably a link with the feeder from pigs, and I have not seen that data, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, that's not even to mention that we could be supplementing litter size in pigs by putting out so
Yeah,
much corn.
right.
And
There is a great study from Europe, European wild boar, showing subsidies from agricultural sources and oak masting affecting litter size.
hmm
So if you are supplementing pigs, then you probably are supplementing their litter size. another thing before I forget with the pathogen loading around feeders, first of all, in the Huang et al. 2022 study, it wasn't just coccidia. They also found a 230% increase in the amount of nematodes around.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really even know what a nematode is, but I don't want it around. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that's another one of those. I definitely don't want to drink after it. Oh
basically just
gosh, I can't
basically
get
just
over that image.
basically just worms.
Little worms. Oh
Yeah.
gosh, yuck.
Nematode worms,
Yeah.
parasites.
So the other thing I wanted to note from the Murray review that we have linked, Murray et al. 2016, 77% of the studies that looked for it found pathogen loading occurring near feeders.
Mm-hmm.
77% that looked for it.
So I'm gonna try to encapsulate all this, and I'm probably gonna miss an aspect of it because it is so multifactorial. And help me if I do. All right.
Yes.
But when we put corn, let's say we put corn bait out on the ground. We draw turkeys in. We could potentially be poisoning them with aflatoxin. And even if it's not at a fatal rate, we could be suppressing their immune system. And if we're suppressing their immune system, and we also know that pathogen loading is greater around those feeders,
Yeah.
we're
Also,
potentially,
one thing before you get to
yeah.
that, it's also not matching their nutritional demands for the majority of the year.
So it's junk food.
Yeah.
We're making them more susceptible to disease. We're introducing or inoculating them with more disease at a higher rate because of the pathogen loading around the feeder. We're potentially decreasing their reproductive output if they're coming into contact with aflatoxin. We're potentially decreasing their reproductive output by either supplementing predator populations or concentrating predator movements around that feeder, and if the hen chooses to nest nearby.
Or decreasing litter size.
Or decreasing litter
I found
size.
some. I don't have the references right on hand because I wasn't. I was expecting to bring that up during the aflatoxin episode, but that's one of the effects.
And we're drawing in pigs that create wallows that are nasty and that could potentially infect turkeys with other stuff. And or maybe even supplementing pig populations if there's enough bait that's out there on the landscape, which can be a direct resource competitor with turkeys. Have I missed anything?
Well, let's see. Pathogen loading, disease transmission, aflatoxin, predation. I'd say that pretty well covers it. There's probably some other stuff that we're not even. Like I said, when you start digging around in this literature, I don't even know which way to turn, man.
Right. It's easy to get pulled in many different
Right.
directions.
With the disease transmission, let's be clear about that. We don't we can't show that there are more diseased turkeys because of feeding.
No.
However, a lot of diseases are density dependent, which the density of turkeys and all this other stuff that's used in those feeders is artificially high near that feeder.
Right.
And we do have pretty good data. I looked up another review. I don't know if you saw this one, Sorensen et al.,
I did.
2014.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there are two where we're pretty close to smoking guns on this feeding issue in terms of disease transmission risk of density dependent diseases, and that is tuberculosis and brucellosis.
Mm-hmm.
Both were clearly elevated. One, let's see, the tuberculosis was in Michigan, was elevated in fed populations compared to unfed, and brucellosis was so in the elk fed populations in the greater Yellowstone area
Mm-hmm.
than uh, than the other. Not to mention the, let's see, I'm having see, here's my writing problem again. I can't read the number. I know it's over 90, but there was increased disease transmission in 95% of studies. I'm pretty sure it says 95, but it's 90 something. 90 something percent of studies that looked for it
Yeah.
in the Murray et al. Review. So we don't have that data with turkey specifically, but density dependent diseases, very high likelihood, given that we have data from several systems. It's kind of a
Right.
principle of disease ecology, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. And going back to that Sorensen paper, I pulled an excerpt of that I felt like was really kind of powerful. They said that along the same lines of what you just shared, current information is sufficient to conclude that providing food to wildlife through supplemental feeding or baiting has great potential to negatively impact species health and represents a non-natural arena for disease transmission and preservation. Ultimately, this undermines the initial purpose of feeding practices.
I'm just going to go ahead and turn to the next page. I mean, that sums it up, man. It really does. Think about it from that perspective. What are you trying to accomplish? And are you getting closer to that or farther from it?
Yeah, but like you said, I mean, we don't have, direct evidence linking a lot of this stuff to turkey population decline or even turkey vital rates for that matter. But man, it's just so ubiquitous across so many species. I mean, we discovered aflatoxin because of turkeys dying from being fed, this tainted grain.
The the agricultural industry notes that turkeys are particularly susceptible to it. Yeah,
It makes me lose sleep at night.
it does me. That is honest, because I think it's one of those issues that, man, we got to get some data on this. The other thing is, I know, like, we've had an overwhelmingly positive response from this podcast from our
Hmm.
listeners, but I think we just lost some support.
Yeah.
And that it is what it is, I
Yeah.
guess. That we're trying not to shy away from these issues. We came out of the gate with it. We've stayed true. It's our job to give you data, make you aware of what we know and what we don't know. And I don't think this one's going to make many friends, but you know, here we are.
I think if there's a group of people though that are open to kind of being introspective with their practices and performing an honest evaluation of what they do and the relative risk or the pros and the cons that come along with it, that is turkey hunters though.
I agree.
I feel like turkey hunters more so than anyone else are willing to be inward facing and to self criticize what they're doing
Yeah,
and
let's
open to
self
changing
reflect.
practices if it's needed.
Hmm. I agree. So, what can we do about this?
Generally speaking, mitigating risk. I think Dr. Dwayne Elmore put together an extension publication on that out of
Hmm.
Oklahoma State.
Yeah,
Um,
we can link that in here.
Happy to link that, but first and foremost, if you're going to consider a feed, consider one like Milo that
Hmm.
is not as likely to grow aflatoxin. Some grains are more susceptible to it than others, as we talked about a little bit earlier. Avoid warm, wet times of the year. Avoid having it on the ground. Um, what else am I missing?
Well, I think even in the case that you're using pellets, be aware of what the base of that pellet is.
Yeah. Well, it's going
I've
to have a grain base, right?
Yeah, most of
Almost
them.
every time.
Yep. So it matters a lot what grain it is, but I got sent a tag recently, actually multiple. There have been a few landowners that have sent me the tag and asked, would this be an okay alternative?
Hmm.
And but actually from 3 different states. So people were thinking about this, at least a few of them. Would this be a okay alternative? And in each of the cases, it just said some like a grain. byproducts or something like that was the base.
Mm.
So I don't know what to tell you in that case. It's probably better than corn, but it's hard to know without knowing what's in it.
Are you aware of any studies that have tested aflatoxin in pelleted feed?
No, I think that it's routine to test it before it goes out,
Mm-hmm.
but I do not know.
Yeah, I don't either. Got anything else?
Well, I was going to say, you want to look that up real quick? I haven't specifically looked for that,
I haven't either.
so it's probably better than corn. Yeah. So,
Well, the other question too is relative to the podcast is how much pelleted feed are turkeys even eating?
well, I don't know. I actually have never put it out, so I really don't know.
Yeah.
Um, so that being said, regarding the timing, so there's one, the length of time, but also the timing in the year. During the
Mm-hmm.
warm, humid months, problem for aflatoxins. I would say, when would you feed raccoons if you wanted them to be more abundant, like to respond positively? Probably
Throughout winter.
yes. You fatten them up for winter so they have a good hatch. We'll say since we're all turkeys
I mean, they
hatch in
have
the
their
spring.
they're talking about the coon hatch. We're gonna get banned from the turkey world.
Well, I was trying to stay on topic. So, so now we got the warm summer months, the winter. When if you're going to increase in S predation, that'd be during nesting season, which is depending on where you're at, somewhere between March and June. Uh, Poults definitely right after nesting season. If you want to avoid them, you'd avoid that time. So basically, April through late summer, depending on where you're at.
Yeah, I mean, I think like down here, most of your hatches, most of your most of your nests are hatching around mid-April or mid-May, um, and
Yeah.
continuing hatches on into June. Um,
So I'd say they're particularly sensitive right then,
yeah,
but they should be eating principally insects.
really through July and August. There's some concerns, but like I told you that paper at the beginning, they were finding when they originally discovered aflatoxins, they had some of those poults that were 10 to 16 weeks old that died from it.
Hmm.
So that pretty much sends you all the way through fall and into winter.
Yep. So if you're gonna do it, consider doing it for a very short period of time.
Yeah. Well, that's all I got.
Yep. I feel like we've belabored this point, and we better get ready because I got a feeling there's gonna be some unhappy campers with this one.
Especially this time of year. I mean, you can't go to a sporting goods store around here and not see the bags of corn just rolling out the door.
Well, I think that's another thing to note. The financial aspects of this are tremendous. I mean, there's so much wildlife feed being
Hmm.
sold.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt that there is a part, like it's fueling the economy probably in some places.
Do you know I lose my mind every time I see something like this. But in the past 2 weeks, I've been out shopping with the family on the weekend, and I found that my Sam's Club is now selling corn, and my Lowe's home improvement store is selling corn.
Milo's,
Nah, just Lowe's. The Lowe's that I shop
and
at.
they don't sell Milo.
Yeah. And we've been talking about truck stops a lot today. We've got a Bucky's right down the road, and they
Hmm.
sell corn too, and
Yeah.
feeders. You can buy it's one stop shop.
Yeah. Well, they've got bins now. You just pull up to them and dump it in.
Yeah. So you can stop in at Buc-ee's and get your refreshment, whether you want to get that out of the refrigerator or the toilet stall like we talked about earlier. And then you can go pick up your feeder and your corn at the same time.
Golly, we are not making any friends here.
I mean, but they do have really clean toilets.
I swear. I've had like a noticeable reaction to that every time you've said it.
All right, we need to quit while we're behind.
We're way behind now. Way behind. All right, folks. Thanks. Maybe wait a couple episodes if you haven't rated us before you go and leave us a bad one. Yeah. Thanks, everybody, for the support. This was a hard topic for us to cover because we know it is so widely embraced, and we also didn't find much positive to say about it. So
yeah. I mean, that's kind of what we're trying to do. I know we were being silly in some points just like a minute ago, but that's what we're trying to do here is just talk about the things that just following the science, so to speak. I mean, I know that's a term that a lot of people.
It's also something that is actionable for everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody keeps talking to us about trying to give you something that you can do or not do on your property. And I think this is as relevant as any issue we've covered.
Right.
So, we're trying to stay the course and give you the best data we can find. If you have access to some data somewhere that we missed and you want us to cover it, we'll do it. I'm happy to do that. I don't want to go through stuff like this and realize a practice that's this ubiquitous. I can't find a positive for turkeys. You think I would?
Right.
No.
Yep.
I was kind of hoping like we'd find some silver linings,
but it would take a lot to overcome all the potential negative side effects. So.
Right.
All right. Well, we appreciate it, guys.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the support.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.